All right. Well, hello everyone. My name is Scott Gagne with the New England Prevention Technology Transfer Center, which is based in Ed Care Educational Institute of Maine, and here to talk about cannabis in the era of commercialization. Excuse me, a little disclaimer before I get started, which is that my time in this presentation is sponsored or funded through our cooperative agreement with SAMHSA to serve as the New England Prevention Technology Transfer Center. So the views and opinions that I give today are not necessarily representative of those of SAMHSA or the federal government. And for folks who may not be familiar with the PTTC, just a quick story about us is our role is to provide training and technical assistance to the prevention field in Region 1 or the New England region. So it includes Massachusetts and the surrounding New England states. And so we do webinars and trainings such as this, but we also do product development. And actually at the end of my presentation, I have a little bit more information on some products we have related to cannabis prevention. And so we're one of 10 centers across the country. We serve here in New England, but there's 9 other regional centers across the country. And then we also have 2 specialty centers, one that is looking at prevention, supporting Hispanic and Latino populations, and one for American Indian and Alaska Native populations. So what I plan to cover today is really 3 main things. One, to talk a little bit about the different forms of cannabis as they are today. With commercialization, there's a lot of diversification and specialization in the types of products that are out there. So I think it's good to have a little review of what the landscape kind of looks like in terms of what the forms are. Go into a section to talk about the health effects of cannabis, which can be different or similar depending on the different types of forms. And then to kind of go into talking about the risk and protective factors that we know about specifically for young people when it comes to cannabis, and to kind of think about like how can we, from a prevention perspective, try to impact those. And then also hope to save a little bit of time at the end for any questions about any of the content I talk about today, or any other questions that may kind of come up for you as we go through the material. But also feel free, if you have questions along the way, to put it in the chat box. If you have something you don't want to forget later, go ahead and put in the chat box and I'll get to it at the end. So, marijuana, cannabis, whatever you want to call it, has changed quite a bit over the years. But in this slide, we're saying since the past 50 years, but really even in the past 10 or 20 years, we've seen a lot of evolution and change in terms of what cannabis literally looks like, but also sort of the composition of the drug. And in speaking about that, that's one of the things where we've seen really dramatic change is the potency of cannabis products, no matter what form we're talking about. This particular slide comes from data from seizures of illicit cannabis over the decades. So that's from the DEA and other federal kind of enforcement actions. And you can see, and what they do is when they seize, they make these seizures, they test them for lots of things, but one of the things they test for is potency. And you can see the dramatic increase in the average potency of the seized illicit cannabis. But the reality is, when we then look at commercial cannabis in the states that have legalized, it's really a similar trend, which is the trend is more and more potent products. So this comes from a study from 2014, where we see that the majority of cannabis products that are sold in legalized states, whether it's medical or the non-medical or adult use or recreational products, are being advertised with potencies in excess of 15% THC, with many products that are available in that 15 to 80% range. So much more potent products that are available, not just in the illicit market, but also in the legal markets in legalized states. So when it comes to the forms, there's really kind of 4 main categories. There's the inhalation types of cannabis products, the concentrates, oral ingestion, and topical administration. So looking first at the inhaled products, and so these ones are probably pretty obvious. They've been around for forever. So those are things such as joints, blunts, pipes, hookah pipes, some of the homemade kind of bongs or delivery vessels that are used. But despite some of the other products that we'll talk about, smoked forms of cannabis still remain one of the more popular forms of cannabis consumption. And I imagine that's something that probably varies quite a bit, even amongst age groups. We don't really have a lot of studies that look at sort of age cohorts in terms of who consumes what. But I imagine if we were to fund such a study, we might find that there's more smoking of cannabis products amongst older generations than younger. So along with the sort of combustible cannabis products, we also have the vapor or vapor products or the electronic nicotine delivery systems, vape pens, ENDS devices, whatever you want to call them, commonly known as vaping. So these are the becoming increasingly popular, obviously for nicotine products, but also for THC products, and is a big part of the market in a lot of the legalized states. So these can have a lot of different names or terminologies. They can be called e-cigs, vapes, e-hookahs, vape pens, mods, tanks. When someone talks about using one of these products, they may say they're vaping, they may say they're juuling, which is named after the Juul products, dabbing. So there's a lot of different terminology for these kind of products. So basically, if you're not familiar with how vaping works, basically these devices have they have heating elements in there. There's a cartridge that's either refillable or disposable that has a liquid in there that contains THC and some other products in there, and then basically the heating element turns that liquid into a vapor, or not really. It's not a vapor; it's an aerosol, which is then inhaled into the lungs. The trend with these devices, of course, is that sometimes they're made to be very flashy to draw attention, so people know that you're using them. But there's also the sort of the angle of creating very discreet products that may look like asthma inhalers or other types of products. So there's like folks who want to get things that are, again, that draw a lot of attention to them, but then also for concealing and making it less obvious that you're using the product. So, that's one of the big issues we have, of course, in schools with the Juul devices and other devices that are very small or made to look like other things, because the whole point of that is to be able to use it in school or other kind of settings where normally it's not allowed. So as I described, that a lot of these devices have these cartridges that contain the liquid that is either infused with THC or nicotine or whatever it is that is being used. There's another application which is called dripping, which is basically dropping the solution directly onto the heating coils of the vaping device, and then inhaling the fumes from that. That tends to make an aerosol that's higher in concentration of whatever the compound is. And then dabbing is sort of using it the traditional way, or as intended. So I mistakenly said vaping before I corrected myself and said aerosols, and that is one of the common misconceptions with these devices, is where it's commonly referred to as vaping. People tend to think, oh, it's just a vapor, it's just a water vapor, it can't be that bad. But scientifically, really what we're talking about is an aerosol, where you have basically these particulates, suspended particulates, that are in this cloud that's being produced by the vape pen that is being inhaled. And so there's been a lot of different studies and analyses to look at what is in this aerosol. So, obviously, if someone's intending to vape THC, obviously they're getting THC into the system through the aerosol. But studies and analyses have shown that there's other compounds that can be present in these aerosols, such as lead, nickel, other kind of metals that, in certain concentrations can potentially impact the lungs and other issues. The aerosols can also contain these very ultrafine particulates that can settle and accumulate in the lungs that can lead to some respiratory difficulties as well. And that's, if you recall, or if you're familiar, there was something that was called the E Valley outbreak that preceded the COVID pandemic, which basically was lung injuries that were happening due to vaping, and part of it was these particulates that were settling in the lungs, causing damage in the lungs. So the next form of to talk about are the concentrates. Now, the concentrates honestly are also a type of cannabis product that can be used in some of these other ones. But basically, when we're talking about a concentrate, we're talking about making a product that is literally concentrating the potency of THC in the product. Commonly, the end product that is used is this kind of waxy, sticky substance that sometimes is known as honey, butter, or earwax because it kind of has that same kind of consistency as those products. But it goes through this to make a concentrate. It goes through this iterative process using solvents like butane to draw out the THC to again create this product that is super, super, super concentrated. And so the final products can have potencies that are 40 to 80% THC, which can produce a very, very strong high that can last up to 24 hours. And these concentrates are legal products in all the states that have legalized cannabis. And so these are just a couple of images if you've not seen what concentrates look like before. The picture in the upper right shows one of the devices that can be used to consume concentrates. This is called an oil rig, and it looks like a gigantic bong, which is basically is what it is. But you see, he has this long metal nail type thing that basically that you scoop up some of the wax, put it in this chamber, and it's heated using essentially a blowtorch, and then you can see the aerosol or the vapor or the smoke that's being inhaled through the mouthpiece there. It also can sometimes the products can have a more brittle like consistency, so that's what you're seeing the lower right hand corner there. So they can, and those tend to be called things like shatter, or have other similar kind of name to that. So you saw that oil rig. So that's one of the common ways that concentrates are used. But when you have that concentrated product, you can also weave it into other products, such as a cartridge to use in a vape pen. If you have a more kind of liquid-based piece, it also can be woven into edible products as well, or drinkable products. So once you have that concentrated form of THC, it can be used by itself as a concentrate, or it can be infused into some of these other forms. So next I want to talk about the edibles and tinctures, so oral consumption. So if you're not familiar, THC as a chemical has fat soluble properties. So that means since it is a fat soluble product, you can really infuse it into almost any kind of edible product you can think of. So I mean, essentially, if you can make it into something oil-based like an oil or a butter or something like that, I mean, you literally can put it into any kind of food product you can think of. Some of the more common ones you may be familiar with or have seen are things like bakery goods like cookies and brownies, but also the candy forms such as gummy bears, lifesaver type things, lollipops, Swedish fish types products. But it also can be used into things like regular dinner dishes like pasta or proteins, because again, if you can infuse it into an oil or a butter, then oils and butters tend to be ingredients in some of these dishes that you would have at a restaurant. So really the sky is the limit, if you will, when it comes to the edibles, just by the very nature of how THC works. Now, of course, one of the issues with THC in edibles is that it has a delayed effect, because all the forms we've talked about so far, the THC is processed through the lungs. So you got to inhale it, it gets processed by the lungs, and then it goes into the bloodstream, and that can be a fairly quick process. So that THC can hit the bloodstream pretty fast. But when we're talking about edible products, it's got to go through the stomach and go through the digestive process before it hits the bloodstream. And so that's just a slower biological process in our bodies. So that means that THC, it hits the bloodstream later, but also it takes longer to concentrate in the bloodstream. So that means you're going to have a delayed effect. Now, one of the reasons this is an issue is that of any of the products that we're talking about today, um, I think it probably it's probably not a surprise that edibles tends to be one of the products that tends to draw the new users or novice consumers. Part of that is, we've done a very good job of destigmatizing smoking, frankly. So someone wants to have the THC experience, they're probably not going to be naturally drawn to picking up a joint because they don't like the idea of smoking. They don't like the idea of vaping something. Concentrates might seem kind of off-putting at first as well. But something like a cookie, a brownie, a pasta dish that's infused with THC, that presents a much lower bar, I think, for entry-level novice THC consumers. So, but that also means that these consumers they don't know a lot about THC and how it works. They don't know that there's a delayed effect with edibles. So they may start consuming one of these edible products and be expecting the high or the effects to hit much faster than they do. And so what that tends to result in is overconsumption for the novice consumers, as they eat too much of it at once because they don't understand that it has a delayed effect. They think they got a impotent product or something, or it's a weak product, so they need to consume more of it, not understanding the delayed effect. It also poses additional risk for impaired driving because of the delayed effect. And that's where, when we think about policy, cannabis policies, so far, not a lot of states that are legalized have moved forward with opening social clubs or on-premise locations for THC consumption. But, if a state were to move forward with that, one of the things they have to really think about is, okay, so how are you going to contend with potential increases in impaired driving? Because if someone goes to a social club and they, have one of these edible products, and again, they don't know about the delayed effect, you could potentially have more impaired drivers on the road. So it's, something we'd really need to get our arms around. So here's, just some samples or pictures of different types of products you could see. But again, because of the nature of THC, and you can really make it into any kind of product, the possibilities are endless in terms of the edible products that you can make. And the caption here is that many products will appeal to youth, and that's one of the challenges with edibles. Is as we've talked about, when it comes to policy, we want to look at things like packaging and labeling and advertising to make sure there aren't cartoon characters and other things that appeal to young people. But the reality is, if you put some gummies on a counter, even without a cartoon character, that's just naturally going to draw young people because it's something they're familiar with, cookies and brownies. And so even without any advertising or labeling, the products themselves just naturally can be attractive for young people, especially very young children who don't even know what THC is, but they know what a cookie is, and they know they want to enjoy a cookie. And so that's where things like, encouraging adults who are buying these products to safely store and monitor and secure their products is very, very important to prevent accidental poisonings. Tinctures, probably one of the least common or popular forms of these products. But basically, it's a alcohol-based extract that usually comes in these jars with droppers. Again, can be varying levels of THC in these products. One of the common ways it's used is by using the dropper and drop it under your tongue, but it also can be infused into food and beverages as well. So it's just another form of oral consumption. Certainly not as big of a market for these products as edibles or some of the other products, but it is one that is out there. There's also topical applications, lotions, salves, oils that are infused with THC or CBD or a combination of both. These are products you'll tend to see in dispensaries that are catering or in a medical cannabis market, selling them for pain relief or for other kinds of treatments. So that's one of the common ways you'll see those. Probably not commonly seen as something that someone uses for the psychoactive effect. not to say that's impossible, but it certainly would take quite a bit of a topical product with probably fairly high concentrations of THC to have the same impact that a concentrated edible or joint would. So again, not that it couldn't happen, not that it couldn't create a psychoactive effect, but it would just have to be you'd probably have to use quite a bit of it to have the same level of effect as some of these other products. So I want to go into some of the health effects next. So again, if you have any questions as I go along, definitely feel free to put those in the chat box and I'll get those at the end. So, as we've seen, there's multiple and various types of products available. And there can be some variety in terms of some of the physical and mental health effects that we see from using those products. But generally, when we think about the effects of THC products, we see some short-term and long-term effects from the use of those, and particularly the heavy and continued use of them. And some of the long-term effects are those that may impact the health of the individual in the future if cannabis is used heavily over time. So when we go through some of these health effects, particularly the long-term effects, you're more commonly going to see those in really kind of chronic, daily, regular users of cannabis products. Because one of the things about cannabis products is, like other drugs, is it is a sort of thing where people can develop a tolerance to it. So if someone's starting using 20, 30% THC products and then that kind of doesn't have the same punch, then they move on to higher potencies and kind of escalate from there. So one of the effects that maybe not commonly thought of when we think about some of the short-term health effects is the effect on the heart. We'll talk later about impact on brain development and lungs and those sort of things, but I think this is one area where people maybe not really intuitively think that there's a health effect. But cannabis, particularly again with THC, we commonly think of it as something that depresses someone in terms of it makes them more mellow, it kind of makes them relaxed, kind of slows things down. And intuitively, perhaps it's having the opposite effect on the heart, which it can increase the activity of the heart. It can increase the heart rate of anywhere from 20 to 50 beats per minute. And this increase can last for hours even after usage of the product has stopped. And again, that's going to vary too, depending on the potency of the product that we're talking about. So when we're talking about those super concentrated products, that could be even longer. So, and for people with a family history or are predisposed to issues around heart health, that would be a particular concern, is the impact that using, again, especially the concentrated products could have on their hearts. So, thinking of from a prevention standpoint, even, while we're concentrating on sort of young people and young adults, even in the adult sort of legal age population that's using it, I think education on the what we know about the impact on the heart is important. So people who do have a family history or some risk of heart disease can make informed decisions when it comes to consuming those products. Other health effects, so breathing problems can arise from using cannabis, particularly, of course, smoked forms and inhaled forms. It contains many similar components that you see in tobacco smoke, such as tar content, carbon monoxide content, and other chemicals that are found in tobacco smoke. So it can cause complications such as daily cough, more frequent lung illnesses, longer recovery times from illnesses such as colds and COVID, flu, influenza, and then higher risk of lung infection. So it can really set the lungs up to being more susceptible to future respiratory infections. Cannabis smoke is actually recognized in the state of California as a carcinogen because it has at least 33 chemicals that are also found in tobacco smoke that are classified as carcinogens. So they include chemicals such as benzene, arsenic, formaldehyde, mercury. So again, there's this kind of notion that cannabis is natural and that it's relatively harmless and it's benign. But again, I think not a lot of understanding when we're talking about the combustion of cannabis. There's not a lot of daylight between what you find in combustible tobacco smoke in cannabis smoke. We may not have the sort of peer-reviewed research at this point to make the one-to-one connection between cannabis smoking and lung disease or lung cancer like we have with tobacco, but there's enough smoke there, if you will, to wonder if we will eventually find a connection. So I think caution is warranted at the very least. And we are starting to see science emerge around secondhand cannabis smoke. Again, certainly not on the level of research we have with tobacco smoke at this point, but early signs are pointing to yes, secondhand cannabis smoke can impact other people's health as well. So again, caution is warranted in terms of if adults are going to consume smokable cannabis forms in their home, if they have children, if they have pets, other people in the home, to think about some consideration in doing that outside or somewhere that's not in the home to avoid exposing other people to secondhand smoke. Some of the other short-term effects of the usage of cannabis, again, notably THC products, include physical. So there's different categories: physical health, physical effects, mental effects, some novel effects, memory and learning, time, and then overdose effects. So when we look at some of the physical, these physical effects or physical short-term effects, they include things such as relaxation, sedation, pain control, bloodshot eyes, coughing, lung irritation, and increased appetite. So these are some of the short-term physical effects that we've seen so far in the research. Now, I will say on the note around pain control, I think that is still somewhat of an open book. I mean, at this point, there's moderate levels of evidence supporting pain control. Now, that is, of course, studying FDA regulated products such as Marinol, not necessarily what you're going to get at a dispensary. So that's an important sort of disclaimer here, is that when we're particularly with that pain control effect, we're really talking about FDA approved products that contain THC or CBD. Other short-term physical effects can impair eye tracking ability, create a trailing phenomena in terms of visual phenomena. Using prior to driving increases likelihood for accidents, and there's and you can see why when it affects the eye tracking ability. So that really supports the issues around impaired driving. But the other thing that we see as a short-term effect is there can be a slight decrease in testosterone and sperm count and sperm motility. So we're seeing increased evidence around, in terms of impact on those areas. So some of the short-term effects in terms of mental effects. So these can include things like separation from the environment, feelings of deja vu, feelings of drowsiness and feeling aloof, difficulties in concentrating, increased alertness, distorted time, color, or sound, and exaggerated mood, personality, and empathy. So, someone coming into and wanting to use cannabis, they might see some of these as attractive things that they want to feel, but then there are obviously some of these other ones are real issues, especially when it comes to learning. So very important to understand. But going even more into some of the memory and learning issues, some of the short-term effect includes impacting that part of our brain that isn't responsible for short-term memory. THC can activate GABA and glutamate receptors in the brain, which can block normal memory activity. And this is what gets into something that's called state-based learning, if you've ever heard of it. And what it is sometimes when people, particularly they've noticed this with college students, is when they're studying while using cannabis, and then the next day when they go to take a test, they have a hard time recalling the information they studied the night before. And this is why, is because the THC is getting in the way of sort of the normal functioning of that short-term memory. And so it's blocking the storage and access of that information. So that's one of the reasons it has such the impact that it does on academics. It's getting in the way of memory storage and retrieval. It can also affect attention span and cognitive functioning. functioning and greater impairment in the development of the juvenile brain. And so then, not surprisingly, when we see that prior slide, we see that we do see the issues of associations between cannabis use amongst young people and poor academic performance and deficits in attention, information processing, and memory. And here's kind of a scan of the brain, well, not a scan, a picture, drawing of the brain that kind of illustrates one of the other issues with cannabis and THC is that it activates the same reward pathway as other substances such as alcohol, heroin, cocaine. So it's lighting up that reward system in our brain, which is again one of the risks for addiction. Again, there's a common, I would say, misperception or misconception that cannabis can be addictive, but the reality is that the way it does light up our brain, lighting up that reward system, it can lead to addiction just because of how it works in our brain. The other piece of that is it's interacting with what we call the endocannabinoid system in our body. And we have endocannabinoid receptors in our brain, but we also have them in other parts of our body, which can affect some of those other health effects I talked about before. And so the endocannabinoid system, there's sort of a natural chemical in our bodies that is intended to bind with these receptors, which is called anandamide. So that's the one you see on the left. It just so happens that the THC molecule is structurally similar enough to anandamide that it can connect with those receptors. And so that is what is causing some of these health effects that we saw. So it basically takes the place of the endogenous or the natural chemical that's in our brain that wants to bind with those receptors. And that's where we see the issues emerge. And there you can see kind of a picture of that. So, but we have these endocannabinoids cannabinoid receptor sites in lots of parts of our brain. So they're in parts of our brain that are responsible for movement, for sensations, for judgment, the reward system, as I just mentioned before, memory, as I mentioned, coordination. So they're in all these parts of our brain. So then you can kind of make that sort of leap, right? That if THC is getting in the way of the normal processes of each of these parts of our brain, especially the developing brain, we can then see why, and then we would see some of the effects on memory, coordination, impairment, because it's getting in the way of the normal functioning of our brain. I do have in my slides, and I'll make sure you all get these afterwards. There is a link to a NIDA video here that you can click on to get a longer version of the endocannabinoid system and how THC impacts it. So time effects. So there's something that happens with THC is called temporal disintegration. So basically it creates issues for the brain in dealing with time. It can also lead to basically being bored by complex tasks. So it's almost like the brain is becoming impatient in a lot of ways. So it's a very kind of interesting effect that we're seeing in the research. So the time distortion plus the impaired judgment and short-term memory can lead to this inability to perform multiple interactive tasks. So it really just kind of limits sort of the functioning of what one person can do. They can't multitask in the same way, as one way to put it, when they're under the influence of THC. Another short-term effect is unintentional overdose, and this is in particularly a risk for very young children, again, who have no idea what THC even is. They see something left on the counter that's infused with THC and eat it. And because they're small children, their body is even less compatible with processing large amounts with THC. And so it can lead to these overdoses, which often require at a minimum a trip to urgent care, many times trips to the emergency room for treatment, because it can cause all kinds of issues. So it happens with very young children, but it also happens with teens and young adults who are intentionally looking to consume THC, but consuming more than their body can handle, and leading to these overdoses. So what are some of the long-term effects? So these can include effects on respiratory complications, hyperemesis, impacts on our immune system, acute mental effects, and dependence. So looking at the long-term effects on the respiratory system, so regular smoking of cannabis can cause the same lung tissue irritation that we see with tobacco products. Regular use is associated with a chronic cough and phlegm production, also very similar with folks who use tobacco products. And then for people who are using both, and we do see that in the data where there is a lot of combined, where there are a lot of folks who use cannabis products and tobacco products, we see synergistic damage. So it's almost like you got the bad effects of cannabis, you got the bad effects of tobacco. They come together and it makes everything much worse. And as I mentioned before, an uncertain connection between, at this point, THC and lung cancer. The jury is still out. While we see components in cannabis smoke that are also in tobacco smoke, which we have established through rigorous research is linked to lung cancer. We just haven't had enough studies to come to that conclusion at this point. So it doesn't mean it won't happen. It just means we can't, in a scientific way, make that statement just yet. But like I said before, at the very minimum, there's enough, I would say, red flags to warrant caution for anyone who's concerned about lung cancer, which frankly should be everyone. Hyperemesis, cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. It's also commonly called cyclical vomiting syndrome because that's what it is. And this is often something that shows up in people who are long-term users of cannabis, particularly high potent products. We tend to see it more in males and those who are beginning using cannabis products in their teens. And essentially what it is, it's an overstimulation of the cannabinoid receptor type 1 receptor in the brain. And it's causing the body to go in into this state where they're getting very, very sick. So the cycle can reset with hot showers and baths and with a cessation of the use of the cannabis product. So it's almost like, one way to think of it, it's almost the body's sort of very violent way of going into detox from a THC overdose. But that is one of the things that the doctors will recommend when someone comes into ER with this, is they'll say, take hot showers, but then also like stop using the product so your body can get back to some kind of equilibrium. Looking at a long-term effects with the immune system. The usage of the long-term usage of THC products is capable of modifying immune functions. It can exacerbate the progression of HIV, we've seen in some of the research. It can suppress the anti-tumor immune response, which for some folks is counterintuitive because that's one of the treatments that is purported for cannabis is somehow it can be positive for preventing or reducing issues with cancer. But really, the long-term research at this point not only doesn't support that, but also points to that it may increase risks of complications with cancer. It can also increase the susceptibility to viruses. So that's all kinds of viruses, cold, flu, COVID as well. And there's some evidence that it can be associated with testicular cancer as well. So it's important information for males to understand when it comes to the long-term consumption of cannabis. Next, looking at acute mental health, mental effects. So high potency use and long-term use of cannabis can be associated with multiple mental effects. So these include anxiety and paranoia, mood disorders, suicidal ideation, confusion and brain fog, difficulty in concentrating, and memory lapses. Now, this is important because, and this is where it gets to, thinking from a prevention standpoint, the work we do around messaging and education around cannabis, because some of the treatments we commonly hear about in terms of for medical marijuana or medical cannabis is some of these mental health issues. It can commonly sort of be put out there as a treatment for anxiety and paranoia, or for psychosis, or schizophrenia, or different kind of mental health issues, depression. But reality is, on the one hand, we don't really have rigorous research that supports medical cannabis actually being effective in treating these mental health disorders. But on the flip side, we do have peer-reviewed research that says actually it can create these issues, or not create these issues, but exacerbate these issues of anxiety and depression, mood disorders, suicidal ideations. I mean, that sounds very shocking. And a lot of people, when they hear that, when they hear of association between suicidal ideation and cannabis, at first blush, they may think that that can't be right. That sounds like a fear tactic or a scare tactic. But the reality is, we are seeing more and more evidence and research that points to, at the very minimum, an association between suicide risk and long-term use of high potent cannabis products. So it certainly is a challenge for messaging, because a lot of folks at first blush will not believe it. But we just have to kind of figure out how do we message around that in an effective way. But and this dovetails into this slide, looking at dependence, which is one of the other long-term effects of chronic daily cannabis use, is developing an addiction or dependency to the substance. And as I mentioned, tolerance can increase rapidly, and there can be a need for more and more potent products. But one we see in the research what some of the withdrawal symptoms look like when someone stops using cannabis after they've used for a long time. And they include things like anger, irritability, and anxiety, aches, pains, and chills, depression, inability to concentrate, sweating, craving. It's not on here, but also disrupting sleep patterns is another withdrawal symptom. But again, when you see these bullets, such as depression and anxiety, it kind of goes back to the prior slide when we talked about some of the mental health effects. So if someone talks about, oh, I use cannabis because it helps with my depression or with my anxiety, and you get more into that conversation, they say, well, yeah, because when I stop using, I feel more anxious or I feel more depressed. So it really begs a sort of chicken and the egg question, which is, which happened first? Did you already have the depression and the anxiety, and then you started using cannabis, or is the depression and anxiety only starting to show up when you stop using cannabis? Because those are two different scenarios. If one is a withdrawal symptom, one is a pre-existing mental health condition. So again, in terms of education, it does provide a challenge, because on the one hand, we have medical cannabis markets in our states that are promoting, medical cannabis for things like depression and anxiety, not really having peer-reviewed, rigorous research backing it up. Where on the flip side, we have peer-reviewed research showing, well, that actually may not be a good idea because it may make the problems worse. So it certainly provides some challenges for us, and hopefully more and more research goes into this to help us kind of bolster our case, and like find the right ways to reach people to make sure they understand these important issues. All right, so I want to kind of next go into just talking a little bit about risk and protective factors and sort of prevention approaches, and then open it up for any questions that folks might have. So SAMHSA has a new-ish, actually in the past year and a half, this came out, evidence-based resource guide on preventing cannabis use amongst youth. There's a lot of great stuff in here. If you've not seen it, again, this slide deck will have a live link to it, so you can download it. It's a free resource. Definitely encourage you to check it out. But it has some evidence-based programs and approaches that can be effective for preventing or reducing cannabis use amongst young people. But the other section that's pretty helpful in here is it has a section that looks at some of the risk and protective factors the research points to for cannabis use in young people. So what this is in different kind of layered or different spheres of influence, what the research points to as protective factors that can reduce the likelihood that a young person will use or become addicted to cannabis, or the risk factors that will increase the risks of a young person. So when we look at sort of the individual level of influences, some of the protective factors that we see in the research are self-efficacy to say no to substance use, having future college aspirations, peer disapproval of cannabis use, and being involved in sports and physical activities. So that means, if we're thinking about prevention approaches for cannabis use, on the one hand, we can look for a program like a manualized kind of program that we can offer in a school that teaches about cannabis and like reduces, and educates in that way. But when we look at these protective factors, we can see other strategies that might be helpful, such as getting more kids involved in sports or helping kids to have future plans for colleges or to think about, their their social circles and the impact that that has. Like if we can impact those protective factors while we're also doing the in-school program, and really build up those protective factors, we can really reduce those risks for young people. So it's like kind of hitting it head on with education, but also through these sort of protective factor contexts that we can also prevent. Looking at the individual risk factors, they include antisocial behavior, high sensation seeking, aggression, usage of cannabis that can lead to the using of other substances, and then the flip side of that, other substances that may lead to the risks of using cannabis, perceptions of peer cannabis use, low perceptions of use, and genetics. So those are some of the individual risks, risk and protective factors. We look at the family sphere of influence. What we see as some of the protective factors include parental identification. So that basically means a young person wanting to be like their mom or dad. Maternal affection, higher parental monitoring of child behavior, restrictive cannabis specific parental rules, so parents having specific rules around in the home around cannabis, and then perceived parental trust. So these are all things that serve as protective factors to reduce risks of youth cannabis use. Some of the risk factors in the family can include parental acceptance of substance use, parents or older siblings using substances, family conflicts, poor parent and youth relationships, and then parents who did not graduate high school. Looking at the school sphere of influence. So protective factors include things like school belonging, being involved in school, having an authoritative school environment, school connectedness, and having a remedial approach to cannabis policy violations. Some of the risk factors include low policy enforcement, out of school suspension, and high absenteeism. Now, this provides a little bit of a balancing act. So on the one hand, we see a risk factor is out of school suspension. So, kicking someone out of school for a week to 2 weeks because of they brought an edible in or something is going to be a risk factor. On the other hand, the do nothing approach isn't going to work either, because we see authoritative school environment and having a remedial approach to policy violations as a protective factor. So it's a balancing act. You can't do nothing, you can't ignore it, but you can't be too harsh on it either. So it does, at least according to this evidence, so it does provide a interesting balancing act we have to do in the area of school policy. And then we look at the community level of influence. The protective factors include things like pro-social opportunities and community norms that discourage youth use of any substances, but as well as cannabis. And then when you look at the risk factors, these are basically all things that pertain to the industry itself. So it's the widespread availability of cannabis, greater cannabis outlet density, more days and hours of operations, exposure to marketing, youth exposure to marketing and advertising on social media, owning, branded t-shirts and hoodies and things with cannabis slogans on them, and then just the products themselves. So those are community level risk factors. So then our approach from a prevention standpoint, we're familiar with the strategic prevention framework. And so one of the things we can do is, as legalization and policies change in our states and our communities, just through focus groups and through surveys, think about some of the questions we can ask to kind of monitor how things are going. Are we seeing any changes in consumption amongst young people and young adults? Are we seeing any shifting patterns amongst adult use that may have spillover effects for young people? Are we seeing any changes in policy because of the pandemic or just natural policy changes that are changing things? So, through our assessment phase, we can kind of keep an eye on what the environment looks like. We can look to the policies themselves, whether it's the state legalization policy or what we have for local policy, to see what provisions may affect some of the risk factors, such as perception of risk, retail access, those norms that are favorable to youth use. But then we can also just create prevention strategies to address the things that we're seeing. So, for example, if we see an issue with retail access in our community, and one of the issues of some of the dispensaries are not carding their customers, um, we can start with a policy that we might want to introduce. We might want to require staff training of all these dispensaries to make sure they're doing consistent carding. So then some of these other strategies, we might want to set up a town hall to set the groundwork for why we want to do this, develop that training, provide a tip line so people can report when dispensaries are not carding. We can increase access to technology to make sure the dispensaries can detect fake IDs. We can create disincentives like fines for dispensaries that are not carding, or incentives like recognition when they are carding consistently, or look at the store design to see if that how somehow is contributing to the problem. So we have these structures we can use to kind of think about, like, how do we shape our prevention approach to it. So, to kind of wrap up, when we think about kind of all that we've talked about and think about the policy part of it is, some of the questions are we can think as what are the opportunities to be part of the conversation at the local level in terms of what we're seeing and how that can inform what we're doing in the community. What are the opportunities to support youth and family serving institutions with organizational policy that can address some of these risk and protective factors? And then to think and plan for, if local sales were to come to your community, like how can we plan to address the risk and protective factors? So I think I left you almost about 5 minutes for questions, but just wrap up that we do have quite a few resources at the New England PTDC. So just encourage you to check them out. We have this focus on prevention, or on cannabis prevention resource. It has actually multiple, it's almost like a library of resources that cover things like policies, research articles, social media kits. So it's almost a one-stop shop for lots of different types of resources that could be helpful in your prevention efforts. We also have a toolkit that has some slide decks that you can use in community education, a glossary with some of the terminology. This presentation I gave today is actually a smaller part of a longer 3-module, 3.5-hour course on cannabis pharmacology. So you want to do a deeper dive into sort of the chemical interactions between cannabis in the body. You can get 3.5 hours of that at this course. We also have a brand new course that we just put up on messaging. That's a cool one to check out. And then we have our micro learning session or series, which are short 5 to 7 minute videos on very discrete learning objectives, and they have little content questions at the end. So this is really great for coalition members if you don't have a lot of time to take lots of 1-hour webinars. You want to do some other kind of learning on the side. You can have these shorter videos that might be helpful. We also have our In the Air graphic medicine. This is covering vaping broadly, so also nicotine vaping, but it's an in-school program that can be used. It basically uses a graphic novel as a way to facilitate conversations in classrooms around vaping. So with that, I will take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Scott. I like I said, I think you did a very thorough job of going over everything, and I would like to talk to you about exploring, some of these other different trainings and resources that we can use.
Oh, sure, definitely. I am going to just put in the chat for folks who are here. I'll get a link because we're SAMHSA funded. SAMHSA always likes us to encourage people to do post surveys to let us know how it went and other kind of feedback. So if you have an opportunity to do that, that would be great. But yeah, definitely. I mean, that is what we're here for as a PTTC, is to support all of your prevention efforts. So there's other ways we can be helpful. Definitely, we're happy to help. This is actually, I didn't mention it at length, but each of the PTTCs has a specialty area of training, and this is our specialty area, is cannabis prevention. So definitely happy to help out for any other issues or needs you have.
Scott, I had a question for you.
Sure.
In Massachusetts, there's lots of communities that are getting pushed a little bit to have marijuana in their communities because of money, because the cities and towns around them have it, and they
Yeah.
think that they're going to miss out. What kind of messaging would you say to those communities?
Um, well, that was an issue in my town here in Maine. I live in Gray, and we currently don't have dispensaries, and that was one of the things that was brought up. Like, oh, well, Wyndham's going to have them, and this town's going to have them. And I mean, for this particular municipality, it just the conversation when it was like, it doesn't have to be part of our brand. So some communities look at sort of looking at it from a branding perspective, particularly some of the tourist towns that we have in like southern Maine. They haven't gone into this because they don't want to have these dispensaries all over the place and deal with, sort of the image part of it. So I think a lot of it will kind of boil down in some way to sort of for lack of a better word, the kind of values or the just the nature of the community in terms of how it defines itself. So that might be one way. Like, does this comport with what we want to be or how we want to be seen as a community? I mean, because the flip side of that, there are communities like the community next to us, Wyndham. They want to be the weed, the weed basket of this part of Maine. So that's just part of kind of who they are and what they want to be. So, but I would say, but in terms of the revenue piece, I've not seen any information that leads me to believe anyone's going to be missing out on any great windfall of revenues. Because at the most, like if you have it in your municipality, you might be able to charge, some local licensing fees, but that's not going to bring in a lot of money. And then whatever it does bring in, you probably need to spend at the municipal level because it takes staff time to deal with this. And that's one of the things a lot of municipalities, and actually even our main municipal association and their advocacy to the state, they didn't take a stance either for or against legalization, but they said, hey, when this comes to municipalities, this is not like this is going to take time to deal with. It's staff time, it's law enforcement, it's town staff. So it's not, so we think about whether or not it's benign. It's not going to be benign to the bottom line and budgets of towns to to regulate it or to keep their to monitor it. So you know I don't see, you have to open up an awful lot of stores, I think, to make enough money just to offset that. That doesn't even get into accounting for the issues. If there's issues with impaired driving, if there's issues with worker productivity, which is something we're starting to see in research. So there's social costs that have to be woven into the cost benefit analysis too.
Yeah, because we had that in Stone. It was brought up at our last town meeting. Like a local leader wanted to bring it in just for revenue. That was his biggest thing, and
Uh,
it failed. Uh, thank you or thank God, but that was it. It was for revenue and to fill a storefront. And one of their biggest arguments was, we allow uh, tobacco and vaping sold and alcohol sold, so why not? Um, but I
yeah,
go back to like the ballot questions around legalization and medical marijuana, where they were trying to compare alcohol and marijuana, and for me, it's just comparing apples and oranges, and you can't compare two substances, and just they're trying
no,
to get something that they want. And I agree with you. I think it is when people see dollar signs, they think big things, but it's not enough to change the town, in my mind.
yeah, yeah. And then like in the at the state level, whatever revenues come in, it becomes a field day. Like everybody wants a piece of it for lots of different things that have nothing to do with cannabis itself. And so there's that part of it too, is like whatever little bit that comes in, like who's going to want it. And you spread it a million different ways, doesn't even make any impact. So yeah, it's just, and that ultimately that's what prevailed in our town in Gray, is like they got real about it. Like it's really not gonna, even if we charge a local fee, it's not even gonna be enough to cover the staff time to manage it. So they said, yeah, we're okay. We're okay not having stores in our town. And Wyndham's right next door. I mean, it's a 10-minute drive, so people don't have too far to go.
The thing is, I think the writing's pretty much on the wall that at some point they're going to legalize sales here in Stoneham. I just the numbers are just way too close last time for comfort. I mean, I think it was around 120 to like 80, something like that. Whereas a couple of years ago, it was like a couple of hundred people said no, and only like 30 people said yes. So
Yeah, it's yeah, and I was surprised at some places here. Like there are municipalities here up in northern Maine that overwhelmingly voted against the citizens initiative. Like it was like 70% of the folks in that town voted no. But they approved after the fact, they approved stores, and they've got like, 6 or 7 of them open up. So even municipalities that, end up like begin staunchly opposed to it, well, they can shift and change. And I mean, a lot of it depends on, who's voting on it too, and who's and then the motivations and those kind of things.
well, I
There's all,
appreciated the information on the different rules that that can be set up as far as checking IDs, requiring security presence 24, whenever they're open, those kinds of things. And, that's a conversation I think we'd want to have, just in case, next time it does pass, so we can immediately say, well, we've worked this, procedurally, we've worked out how we wanted to keep people safe in our community.
yeah, and we are gonna our PTC. We're working with 3 or 4 main communities to develop and pilot a training for dispensary staff, because that's something that came up here, to have an RBS like training like we have for alcohol for cannabis dispensaries. So that's something we're going to be starting to work on. So we'll definitely when we get a final product, we'll share that out for other. And I know the laws different between Massachusetts and Maine, so there'd probably be some shifting and tweaking you'd have to do to it, but hopefully we can come up with something like a core that could be used in any state, and then you just like change bits of it depending on what your local laws or state laws look like. So that's something that's in the works, and we worked with SAMHSA to get approval that you can use SAMHSA dollars on that, because previously it was not allowed, but they've made a policy change on that where prevention dollars can be used on dispensary staff training for responsible service, or carding and all that stuff. Well, thank you for having me. Always great to connect with different communities and be with you guys again to talk about this. So yeah, anything we can do in the future to help, we're here to help. So
Thank you very much.
yeah.